Developed by Chunsoft and published by Sega, originally for the Nintendo Wii in 2008, and later for the Sony PlayStation 3 in 2009, was that of 428, Shibuya Scramble. A seemingly normal day in late 2008, Shibuya has 5 characters, originally living separate lives and unknown to one another, and through specific hours, they meet up, intermingle, and come together to solve a mystery that might affect the entire world, originating from a kidnapping case. Due to the entire premise of the game being a live-action-based picture story, according to details released by Chunsoft, a total of 120,000 pictures were taken throughout the production of the game. According to producers of the game, there were particular problems with the pictured shots in the Shibuya ward of Tokyo. Due to regulations, the team weren't allowed to technically take pictures, so people affiliated with the video game's production actually prevented police from stopping the photographers from taking scenery shots for the game, later getting arrested as a result. Within Japan, upon release, sales of the game were considered average, but from popular opinions, the game was considered to be an underrated experience and better than expected. Initially, there were no plans to translate the game into English for an American release, but after the game was put into the English language in 2018, the game was once again considered to be an underrated experience and received positive reviews from critics and liked receptions from gamers. Due to the praise from the game, there were questions that were naturally brought about by people who had experienced the game in terms of plot, as well as story relating to the scramble. During Kano's scenario, his partner of Yuju Sasayama is almost fatally stabbed during events of the game, but he later makes a full recovery. However, he isn't ever depicted again and is only mentioned in passing. Discussions later held that he was essentially written out of the story of the game to give Kano more emphasis with the other scramble characters. During Archie's scenario, as a result of the SOS gang, one of his former friends, Suzumu Nishizawa, later became the leader of the game once Archie left. But due to circumstances mentioned within the game, it was a lot more difficult than he had first imagined, and a new member to the gang, Yoji Kiryu, later asserted his own influence over it. The rifts between Suzumu and Kiryu became so massive that the entire gang split into 2 separate factions, with Kiryu as well as the gang members loyal to him breaking away from the SOS gang itself. Dialogue between Suzumu and Archie mentioned that Kiryu will more than likely return someday, but that would have to be dealt with another time. It was technically unresolved. During the game, when Maria had temporary amnesia, she was hired for temporary work by Junichi Yanagashita, who was actually in debt to loan sharks in Shibuya due to shady business decisions. Despite having good intentions and in-depth lore mentioning that he was a good person but didn't have much business talent, he was last seen fleeing the loan sharks once they had found out he didn't intend to pay them back. It was technically unresolved. Throughout the game, Chidi was known for eating extraordinary amounts of food. Circumstances had her even eat the entire supply of an all-you-can-eat Chinese food buffet, but it wasn't ever fully acknowledged through the basic lore of the game as to how and why she could eat so much without any real health-related problems. Extra lore later mentioned that the Japanese government was actually keeping Chidi under observation because she had a biological talent to break down foods extremely quickly when compared to a normal human being. However, in order to use this quote-unquote power, she needed to eat in excess of 40% of her total body weight with each said serving of food. This technically wasn't common knowledge for the character in the game. The whole incident of the Shibuya Scramble takes place on the 28th of April 2008. As during the game, the date and time isn't technically mentioned to the player, as the day of the month can be seen on Maria's phone when Kainen called her during the true ending of the game's epilogue. Technically, the game wasn't fully resolved, and even with the game's true ending there were inconsistencies which led to a 13-episode Japanimation released in 2009. Based on the Kainen ending for the game, it further elaborated upon details relating to Kainen and took place canonically 2 years after the conclusion of the Scramble. Technically, part of the 428 story, most players of the game outside of Japan didn't even know this extension of the game story existed, and even in Japan, despite the views for the series were considered to be average, consensus were that it was a must-see for Shibuya Scramble fans. With everything considered, most now believe that the 428 Shibuya Scramble was an underrated gaming experience of the late 2000s, and those who had experienced it mentioned that the characters were more likable than they had first expected or even thought them to be. Tragically, due to sales of the game being average within Japan, despite positive reviews for it, there were originally plans for a potential sequel, which were later cancelled. Sometimes the character can be forgotten because they were respected by critics and gamers, but not enough of said interests to have had any further plans for them.